Good morning, and thank you for having us on this lovely, very prominent forum. And we'll talk about megatrends in urban mobility and how this impacts your city and what can you do. Now, we've been introduced. I'm Arturs Smilkstins. In addition to leading globally the urban mobility topic, I'm also a proud Latvian and very happy to be here in Vilnius, the host country and city.
My name is Sebastian Pfaffinger. I'm project leader at BCG from the Munich office, working on global projects with many cities around the globe.
So before we go into content and the exclusive insights we prepared for you, just 2 words about us. You probably know us as a management consultancy, and we work with biggest world's companies to advise them on strategy and implementation. But also over the last 10 years, we worked significantly and broadly with cities, policymakers, and private sector on urban mobility topics. And a few logos here, but to name a few, helping Chicago transport system to de-risk it given the financial crisis, looking at New York and ROI on transport infrastructure, or decarbonization in China, and many other topics. And what gives us, I would say, a right or a space to talk about urban mobility is we have over 500 experts internally who work day in, day out with many clients, both private and public sector, on these issues. So why talk urban mobility? Cities are changing at enormous pace. Why? Because your city today is competing for talent. 25% of decision criteria, how people decide which city to relocate, is driven by what kind of urban mobility systems that city has. And cities have to do a lot, but also have done a lot and need to change drastically, both to give more space to pedestrians and take away space from cars, provide really dynamic and real-time traffic management systems to really make sure it's convenient, but also look at micromobility solutions and add new modes of transport to make cities convenient.
And as we've just seen on that picture, basically the opportunities that you have and that are out there are endless. What we would like to do is to bring a bit structure into that discussion, really see what are the ultimate mega trends that are behind the shifts that we see in cities, and then also take the step and understand how to actually achieve the city of future, how to make cities more attractive. So let's dive in. When we're talking about mobility megatrends, basically 4 topics are driving the discussion from our point of view. Number 1, it's electrification, both on the passenger side as well as on the commercial vehicle side. We just heard some facts about that one. Secondly, the future is also going to be autonomous. Also here, we're going to see that both on the passenger side with robotaxis as well as with robot trucks that are more and more becoming reality. As well as the ongoing trend for the last 10 years, 15 years already, enormous trend towards shared mobility, new modal shares, new offerings coming to the street, and that is a core anchor to also enable the shift away from private transport to more sustainable transport within our cities. And then ultimately, that shift is of course being driven also by an ongoing trend towards urbanization. And we just heard also some figures about Vilnius. Many cities are working on those topics, right? How to transform cities is an overarching question that is out there and is also driving the discussion. With a lot of music towards electrification, so what we've seen is basically historically, and you all know the discussion, right? So where are we currently standing? Electrification, yes, it is starting, right? Nevertheless, we're still at a relatively low level, currently at around 16% or so in the European new car vehicle sales on the passenger side. And it has also not been a straight line so far, especially last year, 24, many subsidies in core countries have been cut, and you can immediately see basically the dip that has resolved out of that. So the core question is, where is the trend really going to go, and how big, what to expect from electrification going forward? From our point of view, it's still very clear the future is going to be electric. No matter at which region we look, US is falling a bit behind now, China is still on a clear path towards electrification, but also in Europe, away from the 16% where we are currently standing, in 10 years from now, with the current regulatory environment, we still expect around 91% to be electric in Europe. Of course, this number is highly affected by the regulation that is again now being discussed out there, but with the current situation, that is the trend to go. And why are we so confident in those numbers? It's also very clear, because we have strong fundamental trends that are driving towards those figures. You have new models that are coming to the market. We also heard some figures for the next 3 years, but also afterwards, more and more affordable EVs will come on the market. That is further driving down the total cost of ownership. Already now, your break even, depending on your charging behavior, if you're able to charge at home already now, in many countries in the European Union, you can actually be TCO positive with an electric vehicle. And ultimately, as I said, the regulation is, of course, driving the trend upwards. So the future is going to be electric for sure. It's also going to be autonomous. But similar to the electric vehicle discussion, also autonomous vehicles have been discussed 10 years ago. And it's that next year we're going to see robotaxis on the street. Next year it's going to be there. We haven't seen it so far. Now again, the discussion is heating up, and we are very confident that this time it's becoming reality. Why? Massive funding has gone into that space, but also more importantly, robotaxis are now a reality. More than 400 million kilometers have been driven globally already. And it's a trend that is ongoing. It's thriving in San Francisco. You see consumers adopting to that trend, so it's becoming more and more reality. And besides just putting out figures and dreams, why, again, do we believe that autonomous vehicles will actually become reality? There's also many strong fundamental reasons that speak for it. Most importantly, because with robotaxis specifically, you can actually at scale drive down the cost to consumers to about half of what you're currently paying, for example, for ride-hailing and taxis. We think around 80 cents to $1.10 is what you can actually achieve on a per kilometer basis. And that, of course, opens up a massive space. We cannibalize away traditional taxi and ride-hailing, but it's also becoming a new alternative on certain public transport routes as well as on certain private car routes. So it's really becoming an alternative for cities to also enable the people to move within cities without using the private vehicle, as well as also ensuring higher equality, higher accessibility in areas where currently public transport is not that much available. And we expect actually that trend of autonomous vehicles, of robotaxis, to be now constant over the next decade and reach more than 40 cities at a significant scale in 10 years from now. And also to bring a bit kind of what is the scale that we are overall talking about for robotaxis. So in 10 years from now, we expect more than 1 million vehicles to be on the streets globally. But two things to highlight here. Number one, you can see the spread is still relatively high of the forecast. No one can currently truly predict one number. Many variables will influence that, the funding that goes into it, but also how cities react, how much scale is actually allowed. And the second thing that we need to point out is that Europe is really lagging behind what we currently expect for China and the US. Why is that? Of course, it's still not a unified market from robotaxi operator perspective. Regulation is there, but it's not massively supportive so far. Still many hurdles for operators to take. And ultimately, for operators is of course also the modal share that you're seeing one core criteria, right? So the scale and outlook that you can see in Europe is still at a comparably low level. So again, what do we take away from that one? The future is electric, the future is going to be autonomous, but in Europe we strongly need to act. We need to put higher targets, even higher than what is currently being discussed in London and the likes. There needs to be an attractive opportunity also for operators to really scale up in Europe, and by that we can then have another very attractive modal share for the people and citizens in Europe. And by its heart, of course, robotaxis are just contributing to the trend that we discussed before, shared mobility, that has been ongoing over the last decades already. As you can see, more and more new mobility offerings have been added on the map, basically. And that's also extremely important, because only when you can offer basically the full scope from price and distant ranges and offer broad opportunities to citizens, that can actually enable the shift away from private transport in cities again to alternative modes, as we can see here. So that's number one, more and more modality options out there. Number two, if we would translate that picture into figures, is also a significant share of urban trips that will become shared in 10 years from now. We're talking around 10% of urban trips that will actually happen in shared mobility modes. And the third thing to highlight here, if you look more to the left side, is actually the micromobility topic that is playing a central role also for the cities to enable short distance trips non-motorized. Yeah? So that's why micromobility and shared micromobility offerings play a crucial role in cities. And we just heard it, Vilnius is working on that, and many other cities are also working on that. It's an ongoing trend that we see more and more bike and scooter infrastructure is being developed. More and more bike sharing systems are out there, and cities are really setting bold targets, and that's good. As you can see, for example, Paris taking a lead role also in Europe, investing massively in the trend, and by that being also successful in the transformation towards more sustainable transport. So also on that one, we can see the future is going to be electric, it's going to be autonomous, it's also going to be shared, but all of those trends are not happening by itself. It really requires hard work, it requires infrastructure to be set out, and only then you can actually achieve the targets of moving away from private cars towards sustainable mobility.
And trend number 4, urbanization and how cities transform. By 2050, we'll see additional 2.5 billion people live in cities, move to urban areas. And that's a massive amount of people that will require ways to move around from point A to point B, from work to where they live, to entertainment. Already today, on average, 130 hours are wasted on average by one inhabitant of planet Earth in congestion. It's wasted productivity, it's wasted economic impact, it's wasted time that is increasing year on year, and we need to solve for that. Second, we have 1.3 million accidents, and with increasing number of participants of urban mobility, you have more accidents. So that also needs to be solved. We talked already this morning a lot about emissions. Over 90% of urban locations are below standards of what World Health Organization expects. So the sustainability from emission standpoint needs to be fixed. But also, ridership loss during COVID time did not help. Many cities are still recovering public transport systems to a level of ridership of pre-COVID, which means less money collected and more subsidies required. And of course, the outdated infrastructure over time, depending on the region, but in some places, infrastructure really requires multi-billion, multi-hundred billion investments to be fixed. So what we'll do in the next few minutes is two things. One is see if we talk to city leaders, what is on their agenda, but also look at a few examples of what cities are doing very rapidly to produce results and to become more livable, more citizen-centric, and more attractive to people. Now, what we've done is looked at the voice of city leaders. If you ask them, what keeps you up at night? Number one, there are 5 priorities, but number one thing, even above the accessible and affordable housing, is more investment is required into urban mobility. So the recognition of city leaders that this is a burning platform, even above long-term strategy and vision and affordable housing, fixing how cities provide comfortable mobility solutions is on top of mind. Good. Second, if we look at the place where cities are today, where they recognize themselves versus the targets, it's really the average picture across the globe. We have Europe and APAC, where majority of cities say, you know, we have targets, we're cracking on with them, and there are a few saying we have gapped ambition and we need to fix. Maybe an interpretation of that is because really not a lot of initiatives are in flight, as we also heard already this morning, a Vilnius example and many others. Maybe it's because a lot of things are being done, but our point is that if your recognition that your gap to target is small, then you're not really realizing the scale of the challenge coming at you with the 2.5 billion people moving to urban places. North America does realize there is a huge gap to target, and the whole discussion around infrastructure upgrade is very much in flight. Question is on how to fund it and how to fund it optimally. Just New York City is planning to invest $50 billion to upgrade rail network in Manhattan and suburban New York. Is this really what it costs, or can that be optimized? Needs to be, of course, looked at. And of course, Middle East. Half of Middle East very clearly recognizes that they have a gap to target, but they're investing heavily against it. Now, let's look at examples and how your city might look like in the future, and what is already being done with some highlights and examples. From our experience in working with many, we distill 5 distinct stages that are required to really make it a success. One is it's really important to start with understanding a status quo of urban mobility in specific city. What we hear from both private and public colleagues and clients is that they come with a question. We have congestion, let's decongest. Great, okay, how do you measure? Do you measure it in congestion hours lost in productivity, speed into commute, number of trips? What is your measure? Well, we have different KPIs, but we don't really know. So number one is really to understand what is the status quo and what good looks like. What are you aspiring to achieve? And there are really a lot of great examples across Europe and also across the rest of the planet Earth where you can look at how urban mobility systems really work. Second, really important before you actually start acting is to have a very clear goal and very clear ambition, signed off by all stakeholders. What we find very frequently, because urban mobility encompasses many stakeholders, Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Social Development, City Council, private sector, many stakeholders, everyone has different inputs and different views, including on vision and ambition. Super important to say, what do I want to achieve in next 3, 5, 10 years? Is it 5% modality shift? Is it 20% less emissions? Is it less subsidy, subsidizing 10%, not 20% of the public transport system? But very important. And when setting those clear targets, really aligning them and making sure everyone signs off before we start acting. Third is, of course, developing initiatives. And we'll talk about some examples in a second. While also very important to have initiatives that produce results visible to our residents and citizens in next 3, 6, 12 months, not in years. Because our people do not have patience to wait decades for a change. They want something convenient, something affordable, something really sustainable now. And as I said, every city now is competing for the talent, for the 2.5 billion people who will go to one city versus the other. 4, be data-driven. We often see inputs from different stakeholders, rather opinionated, with some substance behind, but really not, the power of data is not fully leveraged. And we'll give an example of how good looks like in that respect. But really be data-driven helps stop the debate, look at numbers. If you have 2 roads to build, the cost, the impact, you compare the 2 in numbers, and it's much easier for stakeholders to decide. And then, of course, putting everyone in the same boat. Today, as we said, the space is very fragmented in terms of stakeholder mandates. And if you were to draw a simple RACI matrix of all the stakeholders and all those roles, it would be a very rainbowish map with everyone doing everything. So super important to put everyone in the same boat. Couple of illustrations. When you have the baseline understood where you are, where you have the action set against the target, and what do you want to achieve in the next 3, 5 years, think about specific actions then to do. And it shouldn't be massive things. Of course, it's important to plan the long-term infrastructure investments, the major redevelopment of suburban areas, etc. But think of what can you do to introduce an additional, what would be the next 10 bus priority lanes that will expedite the buses? What could be the adjustment of taxi tariffs to make really cater taxi to be not a daily commute, which we've seen in a number of cities, but that it becomes a specific mode of transport not used for short trips, for example? How do you change the policy for emissions, for example. And currently I'm based in London. You've probably heard about ultra-low emission zone standard in London, which was accepted a few years back with enormous public friction. But that is one single driver that has reduced pollution in London by 40%. One by far the biggest. There are many others, but that in 2 years has reduced CO2 amount of CO2 emissions in London by 40%. Things like that. And a lot of those initiatives, in a way, are simple and self-explanatory, but really detailing them to a practical level of what will be done in the next 6 months, what will be done in next year, and how to bring all the stakeholders along is what is required to achieve success. Also, you probably hear across the world there is a notion of 20-minute city, 15-minute city. The solution is not to build bigger cities and everyone commutes from suburbs into the center. The whole notion of polycentricity is on top of mind as bright minds in cities think of how cities should look like. So the notion that we'll have a gigacity with a center and everyone commutes daily is long gone. The future is building polycentric conglomerates where people achieve where they live and work and entertain and study within 15 or 20 minutes of each of the points. And it is achievable. We've seen some of the places that actually are working and in the brownfield area are achieving that. The impact. It's important because urban mobility is very much on the face of front covers of newspapers, and whatever you do will be in newspaper next day. So to win the hearts and minds of our residents and citizens, it's important to show results. A few examples of what various cities have achieved over a very short period of time. So one, and I'll actually go in specific examples. One city said, look, I want to decide, I have my metro, I have my buses, I have my rail, I want BRT or LRT to be installed. Please provide me with feasibility study for that. Instead, we said, we're not sure the question is the right one. Let us assess what are your traffic flows, where people commute from to daily, and are they coming from suburbs to center? Do they pass through the center? What are the patterns on main arteries? And based on that, we'll come back and say, maybe we build a couple of metro stations, we adjust schedule of rail, or we add some bus routes, or adjust. And the interesting outcome was, instead of spending money on massive introduction of new modes of transport, in this instance, the decision was made actually to do a number of fine-tunes in existing ecosystem that enabled an additional 10% path capacity of the system. Second example is, and I'm myself from Riga, your neighboring country, many of the European cities inherited bus networks which have a legacy aspect. So it wasn't something that was built or designed given the understanding of traffic flows today. Many of them is basically in our years and decades an addition and adjustment of bus network, which is what we call peer-to-peer. So we connect the two dots where we feel there is traffic, but also there is low service level in suburbs because it feels like economically that would not work. So an example here is in a year's time, a city has redesigned a network from a legacy one, taken a white piece of paper, looked at the analytics of how today and with forecast with all the new urban developments, how people will travel tomorrow, and overlaid that one with grid network. So you have a grid and then you do a hub spoke. So you collect people in suburbs and then you have express routes to the center. And you see some metrics on the right which imminently increase the capacity of the network with the same amount of buses. Now, the ambition is not to electrify all in 2 years as Vilnius, which is really phenomenal. The ambition is to electrify all buses in 5, but also the park of buses is much higher. But what it gives very quickly confidence to people that if you have a more convenient, more accessible network, you actually are able to commute faster and better, and you actually switch to that mode easier than before, and including from private cars. Examples like parking systems, which I think could be intuitive for you as you've seen that for many years. But also, how do you evolve? Because in the balance between the modality shifts, it's important to add capacity to public, which, for example, was a bus network, and then to slowly shrink and disincentivize using cars. And that's an unpopular statement, but there is no way to give more space to cars. We're going to give them less space. Parking will be more expensive, less space, etc. But also, just increasing prices doesn't work. You have to do it in a very paced manner, looking at the data. And this is another example of how a 20,000 parking spot system was deployed within a year, nudging capacity from private cars to public transport rather effectively. And last, I talked in the challenges about infrastructure investments. Now, it's extremely expensive, as we know, and as we've seen, and that's one of the key debates of why we're not doing enough and why it's not possible to do enough. I would challenge that to say, do we really need to spend all the money that everyone is asking? And if this is an example of a place where there were 50+ infrastructure projects with certain limited budget, and that budget fit probably 10. And every ministry, every stakeholder was bringing in new ideas, new suggestions what to do. And it just did not fit. So looking analytically, and I talked about the data, looking analytically on, and many cities build digital twins. We have our own CityFlow proprietary engine we use. But looking analytically on how city moves and breezes and overlaying with interventions and simulating the impact, even before you spend money for pre-feasibility and engineering works, is extremely powerful because you save time, you save money to decide if this circle road is better than the other option, if this intervention or junction is better than the other on a rather granular level. And that really helped the combination of using data, but also bringing back to the stakeholders, saying, look, you gave us all the inputs. This is the output. The recommendation is to do the 8 green ones. It saves you half of the budget, but generates about 80% of what you're trying to achieve. Look at the data, and you see the red and blue, which is increasing and decreasing traffic capacity based on the interventions. And last, as I said, and very important, is to make sure to do all those things, and some of the examples I mentioned, it's critical to put all stakeholders in one boat. Transport authorities, Ministry of Transport, some countries merge Ministry of Transport and Digital, I think similarly in Lithuania, work with public transport authorities and have an equal share of voice of all stakeholders in deciding what the future will be, but also how to execute against the targets and the ambition. And to summarize, our perspective is on the 4 megatrends. The future is going to be electric. Yes, it's taking a little bit more time, but it's the way to go. It's going to be autonomous with 1 million+ autonomized vehicles by 2035. And we do believe that above 10% will be shared in urban mobility. Modal trips will be using shared vehicles. And all that underpinned because of the fact that 70% of global population will be in urban areas, adding 2.5 billion people into those areas, which requires completely rethinking and reimagining how you think about urban mobility. It's definitely not building more roads and even thinking of keeping cars. It's really moving to electric, autonomous, and shared mobility across the modes. Thank you very much, and looking forward to see many of you across the different ecosystems and exchange notes on the successes. Thanks for having us.